Today we are going to talk about vesting schedules. Now, vesting schedules are used in a variety of different circumstances. The most commonly used situation for a vesting schedule is going to be giving someone ownership that works for your company. So whether that be an employee, maybe even a new owner that is going to have some job duties and expectations, that's going to be the most commonly used situations for vesting schedules. But any type of situation where you want to give ownership of your company, one of the scenarios in which vesting schedules are typically applicable. Now let's actually talk about what the hell vesting schedules are. So the first thing to usually mention with a vesting schedule is that typically a vesting schedule includes something called a vesting cliff. Now, vesting schedules are used in any situation in which you want to give ownership over time and tie that ownership that's given gradually over time to performance or to engagement with whatever it is you are doing with that other person. You don't want to give them all 25% of your company right on day one, and then in like 2 months they just decide they don't want to work anymore. Because then you got to buy it back or you got to deal with taxes, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes along with repurchasing ownership. Got a couple videos on that. Watch those if you're curious. But the most important thing to talk about with the vesting schedules beyond the cliff, and let's clarify what the cliff is for a second. Typically, it's going to be a 12-month cliff. Now, a 12-month cliff isn't the only cliff that you can have. It could be 6 months, it could be 1 month, it could be 3 years. A cliff is a period of time where that person is expected to perform whatever the functions you expect them to perform are, and in that period of time, they don't receive any of that equity on that vesting schedule. That's why it's called a cliff. So at the end of the cliff, they do start actually vesting their ownership. So let's say that 12-month cliff. I'm going to hire you to do some work for me, and I want to give you 5% of my company, but you don't start receiving that equity until after 12 months because you have to prove yourself that you're not going to just be a, lazy asshole on my staff or my ownership. So after 12 months of working hard for my company, you start to vest your ownership. And I think I said 5%. So let's say we do 1% per year for 5 years. You don't get that first 1% until after that 12-month cliff. If you are fired, if you quit, if there's any situation where you leave and you're not performing anymore during that 12-month cliff, you get nothing. All that 5% that's planned to be vested, you don't get any of that. Now, after the cliff, that's when, as I mentioned, it starts to actually vest. So 1% per year, and it can be any interval you want. It can be per month, per quarter, per 2 years. That and the length of the cliff and the amount of equity, that's all stuff that is totally up to what you negotiate between yourselves. So again, real quick, just to clarify the hypothetical, 12 months. That's a period of time in which, almost like probationary period, tryout period, where I don't get anything, or if I'm hiring you, you don't get anything, but you have to perform. And then after that 12 months, you have proven yourself, and now you get 1% per year for 5 years in this example. Now, the important thing to talk about too is that on a vesting schedule, and anytime you're vesting ownership, remember that for a corporation, you're going to be vesting shares. So watch my videos on this, but authorized shares are available shares in a company. Issued shares are shares that have actually been given out. So at each vesting date in that earlier hypothetical, every year, 1%, you're not giving 1% of the company. Well, you are, but you're giving a number of shares that equates to 1%. So that's when corporations can get kind of confusing because the actual ownership is measured in the number of shares you own. And so the number of shares you own in proportion to the number of shares that have been issued, not the authorized shares, those don't count for ownership, but the issued shares. So if I'm going to give out 100 shares every vesting date, that is presumably going to be 1% of the company if we've agreed that you're getting 1% of the company. Watch my other video on shares, too complicated to get into here, but just remember that shares equate to ownership, which is different than an LLC. In an LLC, it's just ownership percentage. So 1% is 1%. There's no shares. You don't have to do any complicated math. So if you're doing a vesting schedule in an LLC, you would be dealing with 1% a year over time, not a number of shares equivalent to 1%. Now, Another thing that's important, very, very important, maybe the most important thing to mention for a vesting schedule, is that if you're a new company, when you first start your company, and I'm talking first month or two within starting the company, and starting meaning actually filing and getting your corporation or your LLC, in that period of time, your company is so new that taxes don't assign a value to it, so you can use what is called par value. Par value is like 3/10 of a cent per share, or ownership percentage if we're talking LLCs. Now, a vesting schedule means that you're getting ownership over time. Remember I said 1% per year over years. Now, if you think about it, your company is presumably, hopefully, going to increase in value over that number of years, which means those shares and that percentage that you get over the years is worth more every time you get it as the years progress. Now, that's why it's very important, that par value that I'm talking about. If you're beyond the first formation stages of your company, let's say you've been around for a year and you're bringing someone in and giving them a vesting schedule, you need a valuation done. This is a flat out, no questions, there is no way around it. You need to have a valuation done by a formal valuation firm, which is unfortunately usually expensive. And the reason for that is that the value of your company at the time you give someone a vesting schedule versus the value each time they vest over time, there are taxable implications of all of that. And so you need to make sure that you have the correct valuation of your 1-year-old or 2-year-old or 3-year-old company in order to make sure that there aren't erroneous taxes and values as the vesting schedule goes on. And importantly, usually for a vesting schedule, the person receiving the equity under the vesting schedule should file something with the IRS called an 83B election, which allows them to pay for all of their ownership right at the value and at the date that they're promised it for all of the equity that they may receive over time, even if they don't receive it. So it's a bit of a gamble here. But the idea is that if you're paying for all of your ownership at 3/10 of a cent per share, that's a hell of a lot better than when your company's doing really well and it's $1 per share. So you're paying for all the ownership that would maybe be later valued more now under an 83B election. And then even if you don't get it down the line, that's the gamble you're taking. You're betting on the company doing really well and the value being higher. So you're paying the lower value now to make sure that you don't pay that higher value later. But the gamble is you could not get any of that equity and you paid some taxes on it for something you didn't get. If, remember, you're not performing or whatever that the vesting schedule is tied to. So those are very important. The tax penalties can be very steep if you don't do the proper valuation and then that person gets that equity later on and they go to sell it or whatever, cash in on it. The tax penalty could be significant. I understand that it is rare that those audits happen. Maybe the bigger the amounts, the more likely. But I've heard numbers up to 60% penalty on whatever you would earn on that equity. So it's huge. Now, it is important also to mention that when you do a vesting schedule, when you give anyone equity that you promise in the future that they're going to receive, you have to be very, very careful about when they get it as opposed to when it vests and when you report it for taxes, because there are issues with retirement laws when it comes to equity promised in the future, because that can look like a retirement benefit, and then there's all kinds of rules tied in with that. So to quickly recap, vesting schedules, great tool to keep people retained and engaged. There are tax implications, and you need to be very intentional about how many shares, how much percentage, what the value of the company is, when you establish your vesting schedule, and how you report all of this for compliance. Hopefully this is helpful. Appreciate your viewership.